And even today, decades later, the themes of 9 to 5 still matter. The struggles, the humor, and the message about working women remain as relevant as ever. Dolly helped give that story authenticity and a soul that still speaks to audiences. Her legacy reminds us why this film endures. It wasn't only about entertainment, but about truth, resilience, and the power of unity. The world is standing on the edge of a storm. Two nations, long separated by history, religion, and politics, are now at the center of whispers that could change the balance of power in the Middle East and beyond. Israel and Saudi Arabia. For decades, their story was one of quiet distance, cautious hostility, and backroom diplomacy. But today, the question is no longer whether they will collide or cooperate. It's whether their next move becomes the turning point that redraws the entire global order. A turning point is not just another chapter in history. It is that rare moment when everything shifts, alliances, strategies, even the future of nations. And what makes this moment so dramatic is that it's not only about armies and weapons, it's about energy markets that fuel the world. It's about holy sites that command the loyalty of millions. It's about technology, secret deals, and the silent tug of war with other global powers waiting in the shadows. In this video, we'll uncover the hidden pressures that brought us here. We'll look at the military strategies shaping the battlefield, the diplomatic moves happening behind closed doors, and the regional consequences no one is talking about. Stay with me, because by the end, you'll see why this conflict or cooperation between Israel and Saudi Arabia is not just another headline. It's a moment that could decide the path of the Middle East for generations to come. This isn't history in the making, it's history at the breaking point. Texts flow naturally when we look back at the long, complicated history between Israel and Saudi Arabia. These two nations have never fought a direct war, but their relationship has been shaped by deep distrust, ideological divides, and opposing visions of the Middle East. For much of the 20th century, Saudi Arabia positioned itself as a guardian of the Arab and Islamic world. Firmly against the idea of recognizing Israel, it openly supported the Palestinian cause financially and politically, while rejecting any possibility of normalization. Israel, on the other hand, viewed Saudi Arabia as one of the central backers of its regional opponents. For decades, their paths ran parallel but never crossed in open dialogue. The Arab Peace Initiative of 2002 stands out as one of the most important turning points in this story. Proposed by Saudi Arabia, it offered Israel full recognition and normalization with the Arab world in exchange for a withdrawal from occupied territories and the establishment of a Palestinian state. Israel did not accept the terms, but the offer revealed something remarkable. Beneath the hard stance, Saudi leaders were already thinking about a future where dialogue was possible if certain conditions were met. This was the first time the kingdom moved from total rejection toward the idea of coexistence, at least in principle. Years later, the Abraham Accords shifted the conversation once again. Although Saudi Arabia was not part of the Accords, it quietly watched as the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan opened formal relations with Israel. For Riyadh, this was both a signal and a test. Could normalization serve its own strategic interests in the future? Could cooperation with Israel provide new military, technological, or economic benefits? Publicly, Saudi Arabia held back, citing the unresolved Palestinian issue. Privately, however, intelligence cooperation and limited behind-the-scenes talks reportedly grew. The walls of distrust were not yet gone, but cracks had begun to form. The recent years have brought new tensions, forcing this fragile relationship into the spotlight. The attack on Israel on October 7 changed everything. Israel's response to the assault by Hamas was massive and uncompromising, aligning with its long-standing doctrine of military maximalism, striking hard, striking fast, and refusing to show weakness. For Saudi Arabia, the violence presented a dilemma. On one hand, the kingdom had been engaging in quiet talks about normalization, partly encouraged by the United States. On the other hand, the images of Gaza under fire, civilian casualties, and humanitarian devastation triggered outrage across the Arab world, placing immense pressure on Riyadh. The role of non-state actors adds another layer of complexity. Groups like Hamas and Hezbollah do not operate as traditional armies, but as powerful proxies backed by states like Iran. Their actions are designed to provoke Israel, destabilize the region, and test the loyalties of other Arab nations. Saudi Arabia, already locked in a rivalry with Iran, sees these groups as dangerous extensions of Iranian influence. Yet at the same time, it cannot ignore the symbolic weight they hold for millions of Arabs who see them as resistance movements. This double-edged reality keeps Saudi Arabia walking a tightrope, condemning extremism, but avoiding any move that could be seen as supporting Israel against fellow Muslims. Israel's security doctrine after October 7 has been clear. Never allow such an attack to happen again, and neutralize threats even before they take shape. This aggressive posture places Saudi Arabia in a complicated position. If it edges closer to normalization, it risks being seen by its own people and the wider Muslim world as siding with Israel during one of the bloodiest conflicts in recent memory. If it pulls away, it risks losing valuable ties that could strengthen its defense economy and international standing. This is the backdrop of today's crisis. Decades of hostility, cautious steps toward cooperation, and sudden surges of violence have all collided to create the moment we are witnessing now. The distrust is still there, but so are opportunities that did not exist before. What makes this turning point so unique is that both nations know the cost of standing still may be just as great as the cost of moving forward. Texts flow naturally when we begin with Saudi Arabia's internal vision. At the heart of its long-term strategy lies Vision 2030, a sweeping plan designed to diversify the kingdom's economy away from oil and modernize society. For Saudi Arabia, stability at home is not just an option, it is survival. The leadership knows that achieving Vision 2030 requires attracting foreign investment, building global partnerships, and projecting an image of moderation. Every external conflict threatens that progress. A war with Israel or even open hostility could shatter investor confidence, slow reforms, and risk the very future of modernization that Crown leadership has tied its legacy to. This is why Riyadh calculates every move with caution, measuring how each foreign policy decision reflects back on its domestic stability. Religious legitimacy is another central pillar of Saudi Arabia's interests. As the custodian of Islam's two holiest sites, Mecca and Medina, the kingdom carries immense responsibility in the Muslim world. This role gives it unique influence, but also binds it to public opinion across the Arab and Islamic community. Any step toward normalization with Israel, while the Palestinian issue remains unresolved, risks being seen as betrayal. The Saudi leadership cannot afford to alienate its citizens or the broader Muslim population, especially when its authority is so closely tied to faith and guardianship of sacred spaces. The balancing act becomes even more complex when images of suffering in Gaza circulate widely, pushing public emotions against compromise. At the same time, Saudi Arabia faces the constant challenge of balancing against Iran. For decades, the kingdom and Iran have vied for dominance in the region, using diplomacy, proxy groups, and influence campaigns to expand their reach. Iran's support for groups like Hezbollah and Hamas directly threatens Saudi stability and undermines its ambitions. Aligning more closely with Israel could provide Riyadh with strategic advantages in countering Iranian influence, especially in intelligence and defense. Yet such a move would also expose Saudi Arabia to criticism from Islamist groups and rival Arab factions that see Israel as the perpetual enemy. The leadership knows it cannot embrace one side without provoking strong reactions from the other, making every step a calculated gamble. Global alignment also plays into Saudi calculations. The kingdom seeks to maintain strong ties with the United States, which remains its primary security partner, while also expanding relations with emerging powers like China and Russia. Normalization with Israel could deepen its bond with Washington, unlocking security guarantees and advanced technology, but leaning too close to the U.S. and Israel risks alienating partners in the global South who support the Palestinian cause. This web of connections forces Saudi Arabia to maneuver carefully, always seeking balance between East and West, tradition and modernization, religion and real politics. Israel, on the other hand, approaches the situation from its own strategic posture. Its military doctrine has long been shaped by the belief that survival depends on overwhelming strength. Israel operates with a policy of preemptive action, using force not just defensively but to shape the battlefield before threats grow. Expansion of control in contested areas is often framed as necessary for security, while containment strategies target groups like Hamas and Hezbollah to prevent them from gaining ground. This doctrine is costly and controversial, but it reflects Israel's conviction that deterrence is its best defense. Diplomatically, Israel has made major strides in the last decade. The Abraham Accords opened doors to the Arab world that were once thought sealed forever. Israel views Saudi Arabia as the ultimate prize in this diplomatic campaign, the one partner that could legitimize its position in the region like no other. A deal with Riyadh would not only weaken Iran's influence, but also prove that even the most influential Muslim state can coexist with Israel. With U.S. backing, Israel has pushed for these talks to continue even in the shadow of conflict. For Israel, normalization is not just about politics, it is about rewriting its place in the Middle East map. Both nations therefore stand at a crossroads. Saudi Arabia must protect its reforms, its religious standing, and its regional balance, while Israel must secure its survival through force and diplomacy. Their interests are not perfectly aligned, but they intersect in ways that make cooperation both possible and perilous. The tension between principle and pragmatism defines every decision they take, and it is this tension that fuels the uncertainty of what comes next. Texts flow naturally when we turn to the question of diplomacy versus conflict, because this is where the choices of Israel and Saudi Arabia become most visible to the world. For years, conversations about normalization have taken place quietly behind closed doors, often through back channels and secret meetings. These talks are not new. They have existed in some form since the early 2000s, when Saudi Arabia proposed the Arab Peace Initiative. What makes them urgent now is that both nations have much to gain if they can find common ground. For Saudi Arabia, normalization could secure U.S. defense guarantees, access to advanced technologies, and international prestige. For Israel, it would mean breaking through one of the strongest walls of Arab rejection, giving it legitimacy in the eyes of the Muslim world. Secret diplomacy allows both sides to test ideas without public backlash, but the risk is that secrecy cannot last forever. Once revealed, every concession will be judged not in whispers, but on the public stage. Yet diplomacy has limits. On the other side of the equation lies the threat of military escalation. What could actually trigger open war between these two powers? Direct confrontation is unlikely without a spark, such as an attack by proxies, a perceived violation of holy sites, or an incident that spirals beyond control. The role of non-state actors cannot be ignored here. Groups backed by Iran like Hezbollah or militias in Iraq and Yemen often act as catalysts for wider conflict. A single strike on Saudi oil infrastructure or a major assault on Israel's northern border could drag both states into a clash they were trying to avoid. Military escalation would not look like traditional warfare alone. It would involve cyber attacks, missile strikes, and economic sabotage, all with the potential to destabilize the global economy. International actors play a decisive role in shaping which path is chosen. The United States remains the central broker, pushing for normalization and offering security incentives to Riyadh. Washington sees peace between Israel and Saudi Arabia as a historic prize that would cement its influence in the region. The European Union, while less powerful militarily, pressures both sides through diplomacy and trade agreements. Iran, however, is the wild card. It views closer Saudi-Israel ties as a direct threat and will almost certainly use its network of proxies to disrupt any movement toward peace. Meanwhile, powers like China and Russia see opportunity in the uncertainty, stepping in as alternative partners if either Israel or Saudi Arabia feels alienated by the West. From these competing forces emerge three possible scenarios. Scenario A is full diplomatic normalization with concessions. This would require Israel to make some movement on the Palestinian issue, even if limited, and Saudi Arabia to justify the deal to its own citizens in the wider Muslim world. The benefits would be enormous: deeper security cooperation, shared intelligence, expanded trade, and a new axis of power against Iran. The cost, however, would be domestic backlash, particularly for Riyadh, where public opinion remains skeptical of Israel. Scenario B is the path of cold conflict, where both sides avoid direct war but continue to circle each other through proxy battles and covert operations. In this case, the relationship remains unofficial. Intelligence sharing might continue in secret, while each government publicly maintains a hard stance. This option lowers the immediate political cost, but keeps both nations vulnerable to outside disruptions. Proxy wars in Lebanon, Yemen, or even cyberspace could drag on indefinitely, draining resources and preventing the stability both nations need for their long-term goals. Scenario C is open confrontation. This is the darkest path, one that neither side desires but cannot fully rule out. An escalation here would ripple across the entire Middle East, potentially shutting down vital oil routes, disrupting global markets, and drawing in external powers. For Israel, the risk is being stretched in against multiple fronts. For Saudi Arabia, the danger is devastating strikes on its energy infrastructure and the collapse of its modernization drive. The benefits of this path are almost non-existent, which is why leaders in both capitals work so hard to avoid it. Each of these scenarios carries its own cost, risk, and reward. Diplomacy promises long-term gains, but demands difficult compromises. Cold conflict offers temporary safety, but prolongs instability. Open war brings destruction with no winners. The challenge for Israel and Saudi Arabia is deciding which path will secure their futures without sacrificing their core interests, knowing the world is watching and waiting to see which choice they will make. Texts flow naturally when we look at the wider regional impacts of any shift between Israel and Saudi Arabia. The Middle East is not an isolated arena. Every decision made in Riyadh or Jerusalem sends ripples across neighboring states. Iran would likely react with hostility to any move toward normalization. For Tehran, Saudi Arabia aligning with Israel would represent a direct threat to its influence. Iran has built its power partly by presenting itself as the defender of Palestinian rights, while simultaneously backing proxy groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon and militias in Iraq and Yemen. If Riyadh were to step closer to Israel, Iran would intensify its support for these groups, escalating proxy wars and destabilizing already fragile states. The United Arab Emirates would likely welcome closer Saudi-Israel ties, since it has already normalized relations through the Abraham Accords. For the UAE, Saudi involvement would add legitimacy to a path it took earlier and strengthen a new bloc of states willing to engage openly with Israel. This could deepen regional cooperation in technology, security, and trade, giving the Gulf a stronger hand against both Iran and economic uncertainty. Turkey, however, would take a more cautious stance. While Ankara has its own history of fluctuating ties with Israel, it also seeks to position itself as a champion of the Palestinian cause. Any Saudi-Israel agreement would be seen as competition for influence, pushing Turkey to assert itself more strongly in Muslim and Arab forums. The impact on energy markets and global trade routes cannot be overstated. Saudi Arabia is the world's largest oil exporter, and instability in its relations with Israel could directly threaten oil supply. If conflict escalates, attacks on infrastructure or shipping lanes could disrupt flows through the Red Sea and the Strait of Hormuz, raising prices worldwide. At the same time, closer cooperation could enhance regional security, protecting these vital routes and reassuring investors. Global trade depends heavily on safe passage through the Red Sea corridor, and both nations know that their choices could either stabilize or endanger this lifeline. Humanitarian concerns would also weigh heavily. A conflict involving Israel and Saudi Arabia could produce waves of refugees across the region. Already, the Middle East hosts millions displaced from Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and Palestine. Any new escalation would add to this crisis, straining neighboring countries like Jordan and Lebanon, which already struggle with limited resources. Beyond refugees, the humanitarian cost in Gaza and the West Bank remains a central issue that cannot be ignored. This brings us to the heart of the matter, the Palestinian issue. For Saudi Arabia, any move toward normalization is tied directly to progress on Palestinian statehood. Since 2002, the kingdom has stood by the Arab Peace Initiative, which conditioned full recognition of Israel on its withdrawal from occupied territories and the creation of a Palestinian state. Even if Saudi leaders wish to move closer to Israel, they cannot simply bypass this demand. Their legitimacy in the Muslim world depends on protecting the rights of Palestinians and presenting themselves as defenders of justice in the Holy Land. Israel's policies in Gaza and the West Bank are therefore a central calculation for Riyadh. Each military campaign in Gaza, each expansion of settlements in the West Bank makes normalization harder to justify. Saudi leaders must weigh the benefits of cooperation against the political cost of appearing to abandon Palestinians at their weakest moment. Public opinion within Saudi Arabia and across the Arab world remains highly sensitive to these images. For the kingdom, ignoring this issue risks unrest at home and a loss of credibility abroad. If Palestine is sidelined, any deal between Saudi Arabia and Israel could collapse under the weight of public rejection. The region has seen this pattern before, agreements made in elite circles only to be undone by popular resistance and outrage. Without genuine concessions, normalization may look like a hollow gesture rather than a turning point. That is why the Palestinian issue remains the core test. It is the peace that decides whether diplomacy leads to stability or whether the old divisions will continue to define the region for years to come. Texts flow naturally when we examine the domestic pressures shaping both Israel and Saudi Arabia. For Riyadh, public opinion is not simply a background noise. It is a critical factor in legitimizing government policy. The Saudi leadership governs a young, digitally connected population that closely follows events in Gaza and the West Bank. Whenever images of civilian casualties or destruction spread online, they ignite strong emotional reactions. This public sentiment limits how far the government can go in pursuing normalization with Israel without appearing to betray the Palestinian cause. Leaders must carefully manage expectations, balancing their strategic interests with the need to maintain credibility at home and across the Muslim world. Even with top-down control of politics, no government in Riyadh can afford to ignore the perception that it has abandoned its religious and moral obligations. In Israel, domestic politics present a different but equally powerful set of pressures. The government operates within fragile coalitions where ideology and security dominate the agenda. Public demand for safety and deterrence drives policy choices, especially after the trauma of attacks like the one on October 7th. Israelis expect their leaders to take decisive, even aggressive action to ensure such threats are never repeated. This pushes policymakers toward hardline positions, often at odds with the diplomatic flexibility required for peace talks. At the same time, internal divisions over issues like settlement expansion, judicial reform, and military strategies create an unstable political environment. Leaders are constantly balancing between satisfying right-wing coalitions, appeasing moderates, and responding to the public's urgent desire for security. These domestic landscapes feed directly into the larger geopolitical shifts unfolding in the region. Iran remains the central external factor shaping Saudi-Israel dynamics. Through its network of proxies, Hezbollah in Lebanon, militias in Iraq, the Houthis in Yemen, and support for Hamas, Iran exerts influence designed to weaken both Israel and Saudi Arabia. For Riyadh, Iran represents not only a strategic rival but also a direct security threat, as seen in past attacks on Saudi oil infrastructure. For Israel, Iran is the existential enemy, a power openly hostile to its survival and actively pursuing nuclear capabilities. This shared perception of danger sometimes pushes Israel and Saudi Arabia closer together, encouraging intelligence sharing or quiet coordination. Yet it also complicates their choices, since any visible cooperation risks inflaming their respective domestic audiences and inviting retaliation from Iran's proxies. Beyond Iran, the global balance is shifting in ways that affect decision-making. China has become an increasingly active player in the Middle East, brokering deals such as the Saudi-Iran rapprochement in 2020. Beijing presents itself as an alternative partner, offering economic incentives without political conditions. For Saudi Arabia, this provides leverage against Washington, while for Israel, China's growing role raises concerns about losing its strategic monopoly in the region. Russia, too, plays its part, aligning with Iran and Syria while maintaining diplomatic ties with Israel and Gulf states. These non-Western powers create a multipolar environment where neither Israel nor Saudi Arabia can depend solely on the United States for shaping outcomes. Still, the United States remains the most important external actor. Washington views Saudi-Israel normalization as a historic opportunity to anchor its influence in the Middle East at a time when its global dominance faces new challenges. American support comes with promises of defense guarantees, arms deals, and advanced technology transfers. Yet U.S. involvement also complicates the equation, as both Riyadh and Jerusalem must weigh their moves against broader American strategic interests. Multilateral institutions, from the United Nations to the Arab League, add another layer, shaping global perception and applying diplomatic pressure that cannot be ignored. Domestic pressures and global shifts are not separate stories. They are deeply connected. Saudi leaders must navigate public outrage while seeking international alliances. Israeli leaders must balance their voters' demands for security with the risks of overreach. Both must adapt to a changing world order where Iran, China, Russia, and the U.S. all compete for influence. In this environment, every decision is amplified. Internally, by restless populations, and externally by rival powers eager to tip the balance in their favor. The intersection of these pressures makes the path forward fragile, uncertain, and filled with risks that extend far beyond the borders of either nation. We've seen how history, strategy, Diplomacy and domestic pressures have all collided to bring Israel and Saudi Arabia to this extraordinary moment. From the weight of the Palestinian issue to the calculations of Vision 2030, from Iran's shadow to the influence of global powers, the choices on the table are more consequential than ever. The turning point is not theoretical, it is unfolding in real time. What should we watch for next? Pay attention to the signals. Renewed whispers of secret diplomacy, shifts in U.S. or Chinese mediation, changes in Saudi rhetoric about Palestine, and Israel's military posture after moments of escalation. These are the clues that will reveal whether we are heading toward normalization, a cold conflict fought through proxies, or the dangerous path of direct confrontation. The final truth is simple but profound. The decisions made now by Israel and Saudi Arabia could reshape the Middle East for decades, altering not only their futures but the very structure of global politics. The stakes are immense, the risks are real, and the world is watching. If you found this breakdown valuable, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the stories shaping our world. Q.